too. That looked like the right place to be. Well, good afternoon, or is it? Yeah, it is. Exactly, right afternoon at this moment. I'm Angela Goodman. I'm one of the owners and co-founders of Purely Natural CBD. We are located in Bentonville, Arkansas on Walton Boulevard. My partner over here, Noah Johnson, is also one of the co-founders. He's just a Stanford graduate, you know. And a disabled veteran. So there's some exciting things that we're able to do for veterans, and we're enjoying that. We're pleased to be able to bring to you today an expert in CBD wellness who can help you not only understand what CBD is, but also to help dispel the myths as to what it is not. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our partner, Dr. Bakke, who, as I said, is a leading expert in the field of CBD through his work as a clinical nutritionist. A little bit about him. He's got a long story for a young guy. Dr. Bakke is owner and president of the clinical nutrition and medical consulting company Integrative Clinical Nutrition Solutions, which is ICNS. Dr. Bakke and his clinical care team develop and manage nutrition and bioidentical hormone-based protocols for patients with chronic health conditions. Dr. Bakke also serves as a consultant to a diverse group of health and wellness businesses. His consulting work encompasses the development of customized dietary supplements, plant-derived medical foods, nutritional genetic and blood chemistry panels, compounding pharmacy products and services, and specialized clinical care plans for medical doctors and their patients all over the world. His education, he holds a PhD in bioorganic chemistry. His thesis work was focused on the development of DNA agents for use as drug delivery systems. Dr. Bakke's postdoctoral research was focused on the development of pathway inhibitors for use as chemotherapeutic agents. I took some big words out of that sentence because there was even more there. Dr. Bakke also holds a master's degree in human nutrition from Columbia University. During his time working with Columbia, he completed a clinical nutrition program for health professionals through the Columbia University Medical Center and the Institute for Human Nutrition. Prior to launching Integrative Clinical Nutrition Solutions, Dr. Bakke spent 6 years serving as the Chief Science Officer with a telemedicine-based medical consulting company where he collaborated with primary care physicians across the United States in developing personalized nutrition and bioidentical hormone-based care plans for improving clinical outcomes in patients with complex medical conditions, which we're seeing more and more of that. Previously, Dr. Bakke spent 7 years working with the multinational chemistry, biotechnology, and life science companies BASF and Syngenta as a senior chemist. While working with BASF and Syngenta, Dr. Bakke served as a project team leader in the development and commercialization of antioxidants, specialty chemicals, and pesticide, herbicide, and fungicide-based agricultural formulations. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Bakke.
That was a mouthful.
And I took some words out.
So before we get started today, how many of you have used or are currently using hemp and CBD products? Quite a few. Okay. And then the rest of you presumably are here to learn a bit more about it before you embark on that path. And that's about typical. So usually in the rooms that I speak to, it's half and half. So what we want to do today, there's a lot of big words that Angela introduced, and what I don't want to do is overwhelm you with big words. So we're going to keep this as close to ground level as possible to give you kind of an introduction to what CBD is, and as importantly, what it isn't, because I know there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and if you read on the internet, you're likely exposed to quite a bit of that, both for and against. So really the purpose of today is to give you a good introduction, a sound baseline so that you understand what it is, where it comes from, and how it might be of benefit to you in your health journey. So,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you all able to hear? Okay.
Is that okay? I can speak up, so if anyone can't hear me, just raise your hand, or I'm happy to project.
Maybe clip the microphone a little higher.
Closer. There we go.
Is that better?
Is that better? Hello? 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 I almost have to speak.
Yeah, I think you might have to.
Put it as close as possible.
Sorry, I don't want anyone to miss a word of this because it's really interesting.
Okay. There we go. I don't know, short of having a
Yeah.
headset on. That's a little better. There we
Brian,
go.
maybe, Doctor, you can maybe just hold it.
Yeah, I can hold it too. Okay, we'll try this. Except I don't want people to hear my hands moving. Testing, testing. Yeah, that may be a little worse.
No.
All right, I'll just try to project as much as possible so that you guys can hear. Okay. Okay, today what we're going to cover, we're not going to cover everything on this slide. We don't have time. I do want to leave about 20 minutes at the end of the presentation so that you guys can ask as many questions as we can fit into that slide. But we are going to cover just an overview of what the endocannabinoid system is, and I'll explain in more detail in the first set of slides. But that's basically the system that CBD and hemp interacts with in the body. Then we'll provide a brief overview of cannabinoids and terpenes. So these are the components of the hemp plant that convey medicinal benefits. We'll talk briefly about some of the biological targets, and then I really want to get into special topics. These are probably the areas that are of greatest interest to you today. And these are the areas where CBD and related cannabinoids have been studied as a function of a variety of medical conditions. So this is what the literature and research and clinical evidence tells us about whether or not it's going to be a potential benefit for you. So how did we get to this point? In 2014, Congress passed the 2014 Farm Bill. And basically what that allowed for was the use of hemp for research purposes. And it was about that time that you started to see CBD and hemp-related products show up not only in states where medical marijuana was legal, but also across the country via the internet. In 2017, Arkansas passed its own hemp farming bill, and about 40 states did do this. And what they did is they made provisions in their law that allowed for limited cultivation and also the utilization of CBD and hemp-related products. In 2018, we finally had a full national standard that decoupled CBD from THC. So historically, cannabis, which is in the plant kingdom, encompassed both industrial hemp and marijuana. And the primary difference between those two plants is the content of THC. If you take the THC out of it, you're not going to get high. And it's used, and has been used for hundreds of years in the United States for a variety of purposes. You can use the pulp, and you can use the fiber for making shirts and ropes and all sorts of materials and paper historically. But there was a prohibition on growing it in the United States that had any level of THC in it. There wasn't a standard on THC. Well, that was defined with the Farm Bill. And what they set the level to distinguish between marijuana and hemp was 0.3% THC by weight. Anything less than 0.3% is considered hemp. Anything above 0.3% is considered marijuana. That's a really important distinction. So that really defines the legal status. And what we're going to be talking about today is hemp. That's less than 0.3% THC. And as of 2018, President Trump signed it into law this winter. But as of 2018, Mitch McConnell and the Senate pushed it through both houses of Congress, and it is now law in the United States. So CBD is no longer classified with THC. They're separate. And they never should have been. And this is making right what was done for a very long time, which we should not have had them coupled together. They're vastly different in terms of their biological effects. And we'll talk about that today. So the endocannabinoid system, as I mentioned in the initial slide, is the system in the body that CBD and THC and a variety of other molecules interact with. And it was discovered about 30 years ago in Israel by a researcher by the name of Raphael Mechoulam. And at the time, they were trying to determine where in the body THC interacted. We knew for hundreds and thousands of years that hemp and THC and the other components of the hemp and marijuana plant had some activity in the body. We knew it impacted people when they ingested it. We just didn't know where in the body it interacted. And during the course of trying to discover this, they uncovered the endocannabinoid system. And it's basically comprised of receptors, which is what molecules in your body bind to. So when you take a medication or a drug, quite often they'll bind to receptors in your body to have some sort of desired biological effect. And they discovered two receptors associated, primary receptors associated with the endocannabinoid system. And that's the CB1 and CB2 receptors. CB1 is found primarily in the brain, and CB2 is found primarily in the peripheral system, so in the rest of the body. Now, they're both found in each part of the body, the central nervous system and the peripheral. But primarily, CB1 is a brain-based receptor, and CB2 is an external, outside of the CNS-related receptor. Why is that important? Well, CB1 receptor is what THC binds to, and that's what conveys some of those effects that are associated with THC, the high and the euphoria. Now, they also discovered that you have in your body molecules that you make that bind to those receptors, and they're called endocannabinoids. Endo meaning within, and cannabinoids meaning they're interacting with the endocannabinoid system. And the primary role of these two molecules, AEA, which is an anandamide, and 2-AG, which is 2-arachidonyl glycerol, is to help with pain and inflammation. So they're part of your natural pain and inflammatory modulation system. So they help manage pain and inflammation in the body. So it would make sense that anything else that would bind to those receptors might mimic the effects of something you make naturally already. And that's what THC and CBD do. And then you also have transporters and enzymes. Enzymes they're like the garbage disposal in a very simplistic form. They chew up molecules in your body and convert it to something else. Your liver happens to have most of those enzymes that metabolize drugs. And so when you take a drug and you want to excrete it and get rid of it after it's done its job, enzymes in your liver have that effect. So they chew it up and then you remove it from your body. Now, I like to think of the endocannabinoid system conceptually as like a central heating and cooling unit. If you have, let's say, 8 rooms in your house and you want to heat one of those rooms, you might go in and turn on a local fan or a cooling unit, a window unit, or a space heater. But if you want to heat the entire house and do it evenly, you're going to use the central unit. And that allows you to control each room's temperature within a certain margin and give you effective cooling and heating capacity. But if you wanted to go into an individual room and use a space heater, you're not going to heat the rest of the house very effectively that way. And this is kind of the classical way that drugs and supplements work. They're like that single room in the house. You take something for a single effect. And one of the really important and unique parts of the endocannabinoid system is that it gives you that central heating and cooling effect. And you're going to see this today, where modulating how this system works can help control many other parts of your body. And this is why it is so effective for so many different things. So, and this is what we'll show you. So what the research tells us, and each of these numbers indicates that there's a study associated with this. The endocannabinoid system helps with fat mass accumulation, glucose metabolism, food consumption, so your eating behaviors. So it's a metabolic regulator in the body. The endocannabinoid system also impacts brain function, again, remember, through the CB1 receptor in the brain, pain, inflammatory response, as we discussed, immunological response, stress, and also motivation. And what they found, and of course when this was discovered 30 years ago, the drug companies, as they usually do, are looking for new biological targets. When they identified that CB1 receptors were involved with metabolism, they developed a drug for it. And in this case, they wanted to block the action of that receptor. And they developed a drug called rimonabant. And some of you may have heard of this. It was never approved for use in the United States, but it was in Europe. And unfortunately, it had some really bad side effects, so they had to pull it. And this is often what happens, is that you end up developing a drug or something for a biological target, and it's going to be more potent than maybe is optimal. And that's what often causes side effects in people as well. So this was a very potent binder of this receptor and ended up having side effects that promoted its removal from the market, necessitated its removal from the market. And there are currently several medications that utilize either CBD alone or CBD in combination with THC. One of them is called Sativex. This has not been approved for use in the United States, but it is used in Europe and Canada. And it's a 1-to-1 mixture of CBD and THC in a spray. You spray it on your cheek, and it's used in MS, so multiple sclerosis. And it's used for neuropathic pain, spasticity, and overactive bladder, and it's very effective in different ratios. So they have both high CBD, low THC, a 1-to-1, which is an equal mixture, and then higher levels of THC relative to CBD. More recently, in the United States, the same company, GW Pharmaceuticals, developed a pediatric seizure medication called Epidiolex, and it's 99% pure CBD. And they found that it was incredibly effective for helping to manage some of these really poorly controlled seizure conditions that are found in these pediatric populations. Dravet syndrome, most prominently. Unfortunately, the average cost is about $32,000 a year. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in order to have a clinical effect on those kids, you have to use a very high dose. So 5 milligrams per kilogram per day, just to give you an example of how much that is, I'm 80 kilos. And so that would be about a 400 milligram per day starting dose for me. And the dose range was anywhere from about 250 up to 1,000 milligrams per day. And that's how you end up reaching these numbers. It gets quite costly. For the vast majority of applications, you don't need doses that are near that high. But in these pediatric cases, these are very difficult to treat and require these types of doses. And then historically, you have two examples of THC analogs, Sesamet and Marinol, that are used in chemotherapy to help with nausea associated with the chemotherapeutic process. There are probably somewhere on the order of a dozen or so new medications that they're coming out with that are in a variety of different combinations and ratios of CBD THC. So you'll see more and more of those coming online in the future. So this is something that I've worked with fairly extensively. So I mentioned that everyone has an endocannabinoid system, that it helps regulate inflammation and pain in the body. And what we have learned through Dr. Russo's work, Dr. Russo is the Director of Research and Development at the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute, which is overseas. He's a board-certified neurologist, and he's been studying this for a couple of decades. And he discovered, during the course of evaluating migraine and fibromyalgia patients, and also those with irritable bowel syndrome, that they were linked together. And I see this in clinical practice quite often. I work with a lot of migraine patients, and they often have fibromyalgia and irritable bowel syndrome as comorbidities. And what he found in his research was that by assessing the cerebral spinal fluid levels of those individuals, he found that their anandamide levels, so remember anandamide is one of the endocannabinoids that helps regulate pain and inflammation, that he found in those sick people that their levels were about half of what they were in a healthy person. So we know that there are quite different levels of effectiveness for the endocannabinoid system and how they work differently in each person's body. And that helps explain why some people who are chronically ill don't respond the same way or don't have the same type of quality of life as someone who isn't chronically ill. Now, it's a chicken or the egg argument, and of course there are a number of factors that influence the endocannabinoid system and its health and its functionality. It's linked to poor diet, sedentary lifestyle, drug abuse, environmental toxins, genetics is a big factor that accounts for a lot of the individual variation, but environment also impacts the functionality of the endocannabinoid system as well. And it limits your ability to adapt to chronic stress. And this might help explain why people who are chronically ill continue to have recurring other issues that keep cropping up. Because overall, not just their endocannabinoid system, their entire physiology is out of sync. And remember, the endocannabinoid system is that regulatory mechanism for a big part of your body. So, what do hemp and CBD look like? Well, when you have a hemp plant, and again, we're talking about 0.3% or less THC, so this is a plant that is not able to get you high. When you extract the material from the plant, it comes out as kind of a black tarry resin. And within this resin, you have well over 100 different cannabinoids. So CBD is one of many, many related compounds that have potential therapeutic effects in individuals. And I say potential because some of them have been studied, and you might recognize some of the other molecules that are in here if you use essential oils. Any essential oil users, by chance? Yeah, so what you find in essential oils are things like limonene and myrcene and pinene, and they give some of those characteristic fragrances and scents and therapeutic properties to essential oils. Well, hemp is no different. It contains a lot of those same terpenes, they're called. And they fall within a class of molecules that are known in nature to convey beneficial therapeutic effects. And I'm going to show you, I have a slide coming up that lists a number of common dietary supplements and foods that you likely encounter every day that have some of these things in them. If you purify it, and quite often they do, you end up removing some of the darker material, including chlorophyll is in here, so it's coming from a plant, and that's chlorophyll in it. And then you purify it into a distilled hemp product. So you may find hemp products on the market that are dark in color and are full spectrum, and they have that kind of earthy, smells like, cannabis. And then the more you purify it, the less of those characteristic smells are present. You remove also some of those terpenes that give it its fragrance. And then you can further purify this and isolate CBD. So over at some of the stores that you might encounter, including Purely Natural, you're going to find products that have both the pure isolate form of CBD, which is what's used in the pharmaceutical products, and also the distilled form, which is called full spectrum. You may encounter hemp seed oil. Hemp seed oil, which is extracted from the seeds of hemp, doesn't have an appreciable quantity of CBD in it. It's got some antioxidants in it, it's got some healthy fats, but it is not going to be the same in terms of its composition as a crude full spectrum or a distilled full spectrum or even an isolate of the CBD product. And I just showed that to you to give you an idea of what the different forms of hemp and CBD and how they might appear. So what is full spectrum? Again, full spectrum describes hemp that contains the full complement of more than 80 different cannabinoids, amino acids, terpenes, vitamins, and fats. Nutritionally, there's a lot to the hemp plant. You can do a lot with it. The typical CBD content, so that dark-colored liquid that I showed you as well as the yellow, contains about 10% CBD by weight. So if you had 1 gram of that material, it would have approximately 100 milligrams of CBD in it. So anytime you're evaluating a bottle, if it says 750 milligrams of full spectrum, there's going to be anywhere from 5 to 10% of that will be CBD. So we'll talk more about that when you're considering what products you might use. So why would you use full spectrum? Well, some of those same researchers that I mentioned previously have studied a full spectrum product, and what they've determined is, and we know this intuitively, when you take vitamin C by itself, in many studies, epidemiological studies, which are population studies, and intervention studies, which is where they study groups of people, have been shown to be less effective than eating an orange. So if I eat 500 milligrams of vitamin C from an orange versus 500 milligrams of vitamin C from a capsule, those end up having different effects in the body. It's not to say that the vitamin C that I take in a capsule is useless. It's just not as useful. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of other factors that influence how well my body uses that vitamin C. There are bioflavonoids, there's quercetin, there's a lot of enzymes that are found in there that help with, from the time I ingest it until it gets into the cells and into my body to be used, it helps facilitate that process. Whereas the pure substance often doesn't work as well because it doesn't have those helpers along. And that's what a full spectrum represents. There are a number of different molecules that work with CBD and the other cannabinoids synergistically to help improve overall outcome. It's not to say that vitamin C and CBD aren't incredibly useful by themselves. They can be, but there is synergy from using these things in combination. So why not full spectrum? Well, again, remember, the definition of hemp is 0.3% or less THC. That doesn't mean 0. You're not going to get a high from this. You could ingest as much as you wanted to. You'd get sick before you got high. I mean, you end up not wanting to consume anymore. So there's not enough THC to give any sort of mood type or dissociative effects. I should say it won't get you high. There are mood effects. But in this particular case, there are some people that can't have any level of THC, and those might be pilots or people that are in high-risk positions that are going through drug screenings where they do highly sensitive analysis like a hair analysis. And therefore, even though this by law is permissible, their employer may not allow it. So they have to go with an isolate form that contains 0 THC. And that's why some people might also want to use the isolate, the white powdered CBD, versus utilizing the full spectrum product to avoid that THC issue. Some people just might not want to use it because of a long-standing preference or a bias against it. They just don't want it in their product. So either way, you have choices in this regard. If not full spectrum, then what are you going to potentially use? Well, you can use, again, other cannabinoids that don't involve THC. So you could use CBD. And again, remember, there are sister molecules in there, CBC, CBN. Then you can also use terpenes, which we mentioned previously, which are found in essential oils and also naturally found in hemp products. So myrcene and limonene and beta-carotene. And then unique combinations, and we'll talk about this more in upcoming slides, are going to produce different effects. So some of them promote more beneficial effects in inflammation. Some of them promote more beneficial effects with sleep or anxiety. So depending on which you're using and the ratios you're using, you can help focus on specific areas of need that you have. So let's talk about CBD. CBD, and the reason it's different than THC in terms of how it interacts with your body, is it does not activate CB1 or CB2 receptors directly. Remember, THC, the reason that it promotes a high is it interacts with the CB1 receptor in the brain. CBD does not do that. THC does. So that's a distinct difference. And that's one of the reasons why you can take as much CBD as you want. Remember, it's used in pediatric populations up to 1,000 milligrams per day in the studies. No high. No issue. The primary side effect that they reported was somnolence, which is sleepiness. So very high doses. It's considered non-intoxicating. Again, you might see this on the internet too. There's a big distinction. A lot of people say it's not psychoactive. That's not true pharmacologically. Pharmacologically, it is psychoactive. It has effects in the brain. It just doesn't get you high. And that's where the non-intoxicating part is an important distinction. It does not intoxicate. And here are all the biological targets. We're not going to go through all of them by name, but what you'll notice is a very common theme here. A lot of the targets that it interacts with in the body are involved in analgesia, is pain, anxiolytic, anxiety, anxiety, antidepressant, anxiety, pain, obesity. So here's metabolic, here's anxiety, anticonvulsant, that's seizures, anxiolytic, anxiety. So the primary areas where it's going to have the greatest effect, both clinically that I found and also what the literature tells us, is in sleep, pain, and anxiety. Now, there are other effects that it has too, but those are the most prominent. So what about the toxicity? As we mentioned, they use it in very high doses in pediatric populations for treating Dravet syndrome. I use this slide because I come from, as Angela pointed out, a pretty extensive background in the chemical and in early drug development early in my career. So toxicity was a big issue, and it's really important to do relative comparisons. There's nothing that's inherently safe. Oxygen is toxic at the wrong concentration. Water is certainly toxic, and that's the first example.
Okay, could you explain that? I know you wanted to wait for questions, but I'll forget it. So you say overhydration was responsible. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
so you have extreme sodium depletion. So this often happens with military people or people running marathons, or in more recent cases, high school football players.
So basic exercise then, where you're going for an hour to the gym and walking and doing weightlifting, that's not what you're talking about?
That's not what I'm talking
Okay.
about. I'm talking about someone who's maybe in August in Mississippi, has been, and this is a real world example a couple of years ago. High school football player thought he needed to hydrate excessively, so he did. But he didn't replace his electrolytes, so he lost a lot of sodium, potassium, When he hydrated with pure water, and he depleted his sodium levels, and he went into cardiac arrest. So water is not inherently safe, and we're not talking about drowning here, we're just talking about normal ingestion. Now, it's an extreme example, but it's just to illustrate the point that virtually everything you see on this list we use on a daily or even weekly basis in normal everyday life. And here I'm not talking about, of course, drunk driving, which is responsible for a lot of death. This is just simply somebody poisoning their liver and dying sitting on the couch or wherever they may be. Of course, this one has been in the news a lot. Opioids we're all very acutely familiar with. And it turns out that CBD and THC potentially have a role here to play because they do impact opioid receptors and how pain is modulated in the body. So this is something that where there's a tremendous amount of promise in terms of CBD and THC and other cannabinoids being used. Historically, there are no recorded deaths from cannabis or hemp overdoses. Now again, I'm not talking about someone who maybe ingests an incredibly high level of THC and jumps off the balcony of a 10-story building. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about acute toxicity to your physiology. So back 20 plus years ago, a federal judge in the case had requested that some experts calculate what would be required in order for someone to have a lethal overdose of THC. And what they found was that it was about 2.9 grams of THC per kilogram. Again, for me, I have 80 kilos. So we're looking at roughly 240 grams. How much THC is that? It's about how much 1 ton of cannabis. I'm never going to be able to do that. Right? So theoretically, it's possible, practically impossible. So we had mentioned previously, what would work with CBD and other cannabinoids, these perhaps even some of these essential oils that people like to use. Well, ginger interacts with something called TRPV1, very similarly to what CBD does, so they interact synergistically. And it's the gingerols and shogols that are found in ginger, the active ingredients, that actually help with what inflammation, right? So we know ginger is a really nice natural anti-inflammatory. And it helps with a lot of people who have nausea and other GI-related issues. But globally, consuming ginger can help with systemic inflammation as well. This is one of my favorites, beta-carotene. It is a really potent anti-inflammatory agent and also modulates CB2 receptors. Well, what else contains beta-carotene besides hemp? Clove, which essential oils, black pepper, cinnamon, oregano, another essential oil. So again, we have a lot of synergy and overlap between CBD, hemp, and some of these naturally occurring essential oils. Echinacea. So CB2 receptors are found distributed in the peripheral system. They're found on immune cells, on the spleen and pancreas. Well, echinacea, we know from folklore and also from alternative medicine circles that it contains N-alkyl-amides, which interact with the CB2 receptor, and that helps with immune function. Well, we know echinacea, some people use it for boosting immune function. Magnolia bark extract, same thing. The magnolol also interacts with that receptor. One of my favorites, cacao and dark chocolate. It's a fatty acid amide hydrolase inhibitor. Well, we mentioned previously that CBD doesn't bind to those receptors, but it does inhibit this enzyme. Why is that important? Because that's the enzyme, the garbage disposal, that breaks down anandamide, which is your natural pain reliever in the body. And it also gives you a sense of euphoria. Anandamide, it turns out too, if any of you were or are runners, anandamide is what's thought to promote the runner's high after a long run. So cacao inhibits this, or the molecules in cacao inhibits this enzyme, and it promotes higher levels of that naturally occurring kind of euphoric molecule that your body makes that helps with pain and inflammation. And then turmeric, which curcumin is the bioactive form derived from the root, is a CB1 reverse agonist. What does that mean? Well, it impacts, again, inflammatory processes in the body. So, no matter where you get CBD, if you're currently buying it, if you're considering buying it, there's some really important things to consider. Because it's obviously very popular. You see it on television, you see it in magazines, you see it on the internet. There are all sorts of people promoting this and selling it. So these are some of the most important things that you need to consider when you're looking to purchase a product that has this in it. Clear labeling with the strength of CBD listed in milligrams. This is really important. And that way you don't get a bait and switch. They may tell you, hey, it's got 750 milligrams of hemp on the front. Well, remember, there's only 5% or so, 10% at most, CBD that's going to be naturally occurring in that product. So if you're leaving there thinking that you have 750 milligrams of CBD, you may not be getting that. So it's important to read both the front of the label and the back, and they'll give you the number of servings, quite often, the recommended servings, and the amount of CBD per serving. So it's important to do the calculations to make sure that you know exactly what you're paying for. I think the prices range anywhere from about 8 cents per milligram of CBD all the way up to 30 or more cents per milligram. So there's a very wide spread. So you could be overpaying for something that you don't need to, and it gets very expensive very quickly, especially at the higher price points. Clearly labeled batch, lot, and date of manufacturer. So this is important so that if you ever have a quality issue, if something isn't right, that they can trace it back. But it also is an indication that whomever you're purchasing from is doing their diligence. They're also manning their processes very well, so you know they have tight control all the way from the point where they make it to where they sell it. You want to have ready access to certificates of analysis and impurity profiles. So a C of A just basically is a document that is provided by a third-party lab testing company that says what they say is on the label is actually in the bottle. So it's verification that you're getting what you paid for. The impurity profile is important, and this is a really, really important consideration. Now, because it's kind of the Wild West, there's a lot of product being imported from overseas, particularly China. And you have to be careful about where your hemp product is grown, because hemp historically has been used as a remediation tool for toxic spills. The Chernobyl site that was in the Ukraine, where they had the nuclear reactor meltdown, they used hemp to remediate the soil in the vicinity of that site because it draws up, it's very good at drawing up impurities from the soil. Well, if you're using and growing hemp in soil that's contaminated, it's not grown organically, it's highly likely that that material is going to also have some of those impurities in it. So it's really important that they show you and can demonstrate that there's no heavy metals or other pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides that show up in that product. And again, this feeds into this bullet point, that it's grown using organic farming practices. When they extract the hemp, so pulling that blackish material out of the plant, it's important that they're using and that they tell you how they're extracting it. In most cases, they will, supercritical carbon dioxide or ethanol. Both are very clean. They can distill these off. This is actually removed. It's extracted under pressure, so when you pressurize CO2, it becomes a liquid. And then when they depressurize it, it becomes a gas again, which is what we'll extract when we go through respiration. Ethanol is another extractive liquid. You all know what that is. That's just alcohol. And it's removed by distillation. Other means of extracting hemp are things like heptane and pentane, which are found in gasoline. They're components of gasoline. They're removed, but you do inevitably have trace material, trace levels to that in there if they're using this extractive techniques. And then you want to limit the number of inactive or other ingredients, so to have as clean a preparation as possible. So if you're getting started, what are the general parameters? Again, none of this is necessarily specific to you, but it's a good guideline. Because of the costs, you don't want to use any more than you have to if you're going to use it. A typical starting dose for someone with mild to moderate symptoms, let's say you're not sleeping well, you have moderate anxiety, you don't have a lot of other issues going on. A good starting dose, and I'm using examples here from Purely Natural, but you can find very similar examples perhaps in products that you're using. A 600 milligram bottle is going to have 600 milligrams of CBD in it. It's very easy to titrate. So I always recommend start with 5 milligrams or so, which this is a 30 ml bottle, so you do quick math. 30 mLs into 600 is going to give you roughly 20 milligrams per milliliter. So 1/4 of that is going to give you 5 milligrams. So 600 milligrams in the bottle, we're using 1/120th of that, which is going to give me 5. For more severe conditions, typically 1,200 milligram bottle, so a higher strength, is usually warranted. And in this particular case, your starting dose doubles. So we're doubling the strength from 600 to 1,200, we go up to 10. So about 10 milligrams as a starting dose.
Up there where it says 10 milligrams per something, there's nothing there.
Yeah, per, so per dropper. That's all it is, just per. So this is a quarter dropper per application. Yep. So then how would you apply this? So in either instance, you would increase in roughly 5 to 10 milligram increments every, say, 2 to 3 days, maybe 4 days. And you're going to know better than anyone because it's hard to put an objective score on anxiety. Your anxiety might be different than mine, that might be different than yours. So you'll be able to know what your baseline is and then whether or not you're seeing any improvements over a period of time. Typically, for most of the individuals that I work with, for less severe conditions, 20 to 40 milligrams is fairly typical. If you're older or you have more chronic conditions that you're dealing with, 40 to perhaps as high as 80 milligrams. I don't have anyone that I work with that uses over 100. And again, that's where you start to get up into those really high doses that are just deceivers. Now, take PRN for situational management. So most of the people that I work with are on a fixed schedule, so they use it morning and say night before bed. But if they have great, let's say they work in the garden that day and they have extra inflammation or joint pain they're dealing with, they'll take it as needed with extra exertion. And then you can always take a holiday. If you find that it's not working as effectively over a period of time, you can take a break for a few days. So again, it's like anything else that when you're dealing with receptors and individual variations in effectiveness, each person's response will be a little bit different. But again, oftentimes if it's been working and it stops working as well, you can take a break and then restart it and overcome some of that. That is especially true if you're titrating, let's say you use more than what you need, and you want to figure out where that cutoff is again.
Dr. Bakke, you have about 5 more minutes before we have to go into Q&A.
Okay, so in the studies for blood pressure was found that a really high dose, it's not necessarily effective directly for blood pressure. Blood pressure was, in this particular case, was strongly associated with anxiety, which is where they thought that the improvements came from. So they saw a reduction in resting, the systolic rate, down by 6 millimeters. But again, that was largely attributed to blood pressure. In the area of pain, with head pain, they've looked at it for, and again, this is a combination of CBD and medical cannabis, that you see a significant reduction in the number of headaches and also the pain score, depending on the different ratios you're using. So it can be very effective for anyone dealing with head pain, and that could be migraines or headaches. This one is probably of interest to you guys, so I want to spend the last bit of it on joint pain and sleep. Joint pain, so whether you have a rheumatological condition like rheumatoid arthritis, or you're dealing with some other form of arthritis pain. And we have a local provider that we work with in Bentonville named Dr. Knifechie, who's with Northwest Health System, and she's an orthopedic surgeon. Her go-to is to first address inflammation through dietary and supplement approaches before she ever does surgery. She wants to get the inflammation under control. And one of the things she does for joint pain is to use a combination of both a roll-on and a topical at the site where the joint pain is, and also an oral systemic administration. So she does a combo approach quite often and finds that this is very effective for many of her conditions. Even if a patient ends up needing surgery, it helps them manage both pre-op and post-op in the recovery and long-term with their condition. So this can be very effective if you have hand pain, shoulder pain, hip, knee, again, using a topical approach to start with and then possibly adding in oral combination. And finally, with sleep, sleep is obviously something that affects a large number of people across a variety of conditions. And it's been studied as a function of different diseases, so multiple sclerosis. For that side effects that I mentioned previously, they found that that same one-to-one combination of THC, CBD was very effective in promoting sleep in that population. So it was a subset of the larger study. And then again, of the 13 studies that they evaluated, 7 of them showed improvements in sleep. And this is one of the areas that the primary reasons that people end up using CBD is to help with sleep. So I want to stop there. When you said I had 3 or 4 minutes, you meant until the question or until the end?
Well, what we know is that some people are on their lunch break, so
Yeah.
if we go into Q&A now, if you
Let's do
need to
that.
leave, if you could ask your questions first, and then anyone's welcome to stay after. We're not in a big hurry to get out of here, but we want to make sure anyone that's really pressed for time asks their questions first, please.
Yep. Yes.
How is that being used for someone that might have Parkinson's?
For tremors and.
The question is, how is it being used for someone that might have Parkinson's?
So it is being studied in Parkinson's. There's only a couple of studies that have been done. One of the problems that we have right now is that because it's recently decoupled from THC, we haven't done a lot of work in the United States. Most of the work has been done in other countries, although that's changing very quickly. I can tell you, just based on some anecdotal and case reports, that some of the people with Parkinson's are finding that their symptoms associated with Parkinson's are more effectively managed, because they are neurological in nature. And so some of the tremors and other like symptoms can be helped. But there isn't a lot that's known clinically right now in terms of specifically how it's going to be part of any long-term solutions in Parkinson's. I think one of the investigational drugs that's being developed now is actually in Parkinson's. So.
How long does it take for any of the product to start working? You were saying, you have the low doses, the higher doses. Certain medications you take, they'll say, wait 3 days. What's the process here?
Great question. So I think there's obviously going to be some level of placebo effect. We're all prone to that. So if you believe something's going to work, you might feel better. But there's also, I think, in terms of what we know, it takes a while, and it's a dose-dependent type of effect where you get to tissue level saturation. So there is a leveling off. So the higher the dose you use, it's not an infinite curve of effectiveness. It doesn't level at some point. Where you get to, I would say, practically speaking, it's probably going to be within a week, but some of that depends on how high a dose you start with. If you're at the 10 milligram dose level, you'll get there more quickly. If you're at the 5, less quickly. Some people, it just may take a few days for that 5 to build up, because it takes about 36 hours for it to clear out of your body. So if you're taking it multiple times during the day, you're going to be building up your levels slowly over time. I will tell you, too, that at higher dose levels, it's really important that you have, well, it's always good to talk to your doctor, right, to let them know what you're using. But CBD and what they found in those pediatric studies does inhibit a couple of enzymes in the liver at very high dose levels that metabolize medications. So it increases blood levels of some medications. So before, if you're taking a number of different medications, especially blood pressure medication, or if you're taking blood thinners, you want to make sure and talk to your doctor before you start using it. I always advise that with any new dietary supplement anyway. It's good, because some of them can interfere with the medications that you're taking. So, but to answer your question, it does take often several days. Some people have reported that it worked the first time they took it, and again, you don't know if that's a combination of placebo. And again, if you used a really high dose, it could work the very first time you use it. I would say realistically, it's going to take a week or 2 for you to find your dose that works for you.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, you may have addressed this before I got here. I came in a little bit late, but
What is your understanding of what the FDA's, where are they on CBD today?
Good question. So today, they have an open hearing on the 31st of May, which is where they're going to invite industry participants to the table, and that includes the pharmaceutical industry. As it currently stands, the FDA, because Epidiolex that I mentioned is classified as a drug and CBD is a drug in the strictest sense, that it is not allowed to be put in any food or beverage items.
Okay.
And there are a lot of companies that want to do this. And you have some that have done this and then had it pulled from the shelves. A very similar example would be with red yeast rice. Red yeast rice, if any of you use that for cholesterol management as a part of your dietary supplement regimen, contains a naturally occurring statin that's identical to the statins that you get in the drug. The FDA allows for the sale of red yeast rice as a dietary supplement. What they don't allow is for that medication to be removed from red yeast rice and isolated and then marketed as a cholesterol-lowering agent. So primarily what they're focusing on now are foods. So you can't put it in, you can't sell it in coffee or in like barbecue sauce at Walmart and things like that, which some people are trying to do. I mean, you may see it in a lot of different things depending on which way they go. And the other one is in marketing claims. So you're not allowed to say that it cures cancer, treats any disease. The only people that can make those claims are pharmaceutical companies. What you can say, though, is that it helps with general wellness, that it helps with modifying systems. So the difference would be, I can't say it treats migraine, but I can say it helps ease, headache or something like that. So you have to be really careful. There's a fine line that you can't cross. No medical claims. You can't treat, diagnose, or prevent. It's that general disclaimer that you see at the bottom of every dietary supplement. But we will have more clarification on that very soon. So right now they're just basically saying no marketing of making any marketing claims, which likely isn't going to change, and then no food or drinks. Yes.
I'm thinking about this for someone with joint pain.
Okay.
But is it contraindicated or potentially beneficial if this person has Alzheimer's as well?
Great question. So there's no indication that would be contraindicated, but as always on a per individual basis. So I've worked with hundreds of dietary supplements, some of which people are like, oh, that's nothing, it's a dietary supplement. I've seen reactions to everything. So you never say never. There are always the rare examples where someone could have an adverse reaction. I'm not aware of any, and it hasn't been studied extensively in Alzheimer's. So with anything, if you are looking to
Would the owner of the red car with the tags AGGNN please stop by the information desk? The owner of the red car with tags AGGNN, please stop by the information desk. Thank you.
It's on your elbow and you're applying it to the elbow. It's not likely going to give you systemic delivery into circulation like taking it orally would.
Okay.
So it's likely going to have a localized effect, but if I put it on my elbow and I have this elbow hurts, it's not going to help this elbow.
Right.
Whereas if I take it orally, it could potentially help with both. Because you get delivery throughout your body through the blood system.
Right.
Here it's going to largely stay in the dermal and fat layers,
Okay.
and then affect the local tissue.
Dr. Bakke, if you can speak up a little bit, they're having a hard time hearing over
sorry.
here.
So,
we're going
yeah,
to repeat the question as well, anyone that asked the question.
With the topical delivery, she asked, is there any issue with potentially interacting with or impacting their Alzheimer's in a negative way? And you never know with an individual that everything can potentially impact people differently. And I've seen probiotics make people sick. I've seen omega-3 fatty acids, you name it. So you never say never, but this, in terms of the safety profile, is incredibly good. And then I would also say topical delivery, which what she was asking about for joint pain, is not likely to get into systemic circulation. So unlike taking something orally, which is going to be distributed throughout your body, doing something in a topical form is less likely in meaningful levels to get into the rest of your body to impact. So if you were concerned at all about any contraindications, a topical route would be a safer route to take to worry about not have to worry as much about risks.
Are there certain dosages that you want to look for in
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 a
topical application as well?
Yeah, from practical experience, so it's usually going to be in that 300 to 600 milligrams per 2 ounces, right? Oh, so the question was, what doses for topical application do you typically find that are most effective? So in this particular one, I have an example here. This one is this a 4 ounce or a 2 ounce? Look at this one.
That's 3.
3 ounces. So this is a 4 ounce. So anywhere from 300 to 600 milligrams in a bottle this size is going to give you roughly the right concentration to have the effect you're looking for.
3 to 600 in 2 ounces or 4 ounces?
4 ounces.
4 ounces.
Yeah. So 100, it would be 150 in a 2 ounce.
Okay.
You cut it in half. 150 or 300. 2 ounces.
So when you talk about the difference between topical and ingested, for instance, okay, so topical, if you have specific joint areas, then
Yes.
the topical would probably be what, in terms of migraine, would be better to ingest? You're not going to rub the topical on your head.
You could. I think most often. So I know some people that work with have had success rubbing peppermint extract and other extracts on their temples. But typically it's going to be an oral, sublingual or oral that's most effective for those cases to give you systemic. Yes?
Does it help osteoporosis?
No, it's not necessarily going to help with bone loss per se. I think there are a couple of papers that have looked at its ability to help stimulate new bone growth, and those are still in the early stages. I think in the mouse model, this has not been studied in humans, but in mice, there is some evidence that it may help promote and stimulate bone growth, but we don't have any clinical evidence to say yes at this point. I think the experimental, so a lot of things work in experimental models, like virtually half of the dietary supplements out there will cure cancer in the petri dish, but it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't. So I think it's promising in that area, but there's not any human studies that have shown that yet.
Other questions?
Okay, one last one then. How do you learn, you've never done any of this before, how do you learn what is the best way to buy something? Do you want drops? Do you want the roll-on? Do you want the cream? Do you want something to ingest? How do you learn that so you don't buy the wrong thing first?
We have a great business model. That's why we do it a little bit differently. So when our store, it's over in Bentonville, so you come in, it's retail on the front, and we have a back area that's consultation. So that's why Dr. Bakke and Dr. Knife Chief and some other folks come in and have partnered with us, because we have, as business owners before, we're like, we can't give you advice on how to use it. So that's why we ended up partnering. And there's a lot of people around here that are selling it, and great product, but I think there needs to be something else. And that's why we're doing more of this, and we do educational sessions in our stores each week.
And we're also at the store tonight.